Hello, everyone. I'm Will, and we have to talk about the drama surrounding Baldur's Gate 3. This topic has a much wider spectrum of effect on the games industry than most people realize, as well as being a sounding board about the gaming industry and the entertainment industry as a whole. We're going to talk about and deep dive just a little into what happened, what it means, and what might happen in the future. Before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy the video. Every little bit helps. Thanks. So we're going to begin with an overview about what exactly happened, and then we'll go back and look at every step and what it means, the nuances that were missed, and then at the end talk about how it affects the future of the games industry. Some time ago, on the platform formerly known as Twitter, an indie developer by the name of Xavier Nelson posted this. Like a lot of people, I'm deeply excited about what the lovely folks at Larian accomplished with Baldur's Gate 3, but I want to gently, preemptively push back against players taking that excitement and using it to apply criticism or a raised standard to RPGs going forward. You can't separate a game from the process used to build it, so let's look at what Larian is taking into the development and final version of this game. 1. Dev cycle stretching back to 2017. 2 massive games and their definitive editions worth of tech and institutional knowledge to draw from, super successful early access period lasting 3 years, providing crucial community feedback, bug hunting, and cash flow, over 400 developers in 7 different offices around the world, not including outsourcing partners, the license, brand, and world of one of the largest entertainment IPs in the world, Dungeons & Dragons, at the apex of its popularity, and with the rise of actual play movement and a movie. This is a small, incomplete list. Larian is coming into this game swinging, with a gigantic weight of expectation to deal with, but they're also doing it with an immense amount of wind, direct experience, plus resource, plus specialty tooling, plus, etc. at their backs. As a TLDR, in an era of mega games, Baldur's Gate 3 is one of the largest attempted, and built by a specialized group of people using mature tech especially built to make this specific game, reinforced by invaluable mass player feedback and market validation ahead of its launch. This is not a new baseline for RPGs, this is an anomaly. Trying to do the same thing in the same way, especially without the same advantages, could kill an entire group of studios. If they go as big or bigger with their next title, Larian themselves could die. That's the risk and reward of the mega game. We are an industry dangling elephants over cliffs, pointing at the ones that don't collapse under their own weight as indictments to the ones that do. So please celebrate the achievement represented by Baldur's Gate 3. It looks like a massive amount of effort is about to pay off in a big way for one of the brightest voices in the medium. But if you shout that every RPG should be like this going forward, you have no excuse. You've not just missed the point, you've created the expectations and conditions to ensure your favorite creators may never be able to give you the thing you love again. Now, the response to this was mostly very supportive, and it's important to note that many other game developers, both indie and AAA, came out to agree with him. And there's thread after thread of posts similar, with a few notable exceptions, like this thread here from Juno Blease, formerly of Riot Games. Oh boy, here comes my usual spicy take. I can't disagree with this one more. Whenever a game disrupts the industry and delights players beyond expectations, it absolutely raises industry and genre standards regardless of the why and how. I am not saying games should all be judged the same way across different production budgets and experiences, but I believe most players understand the context to not compare apples to oranges. What's worrying and upsetting to me is seeing the colleagues in AAA studios jump at the opportunity to agree with the sentiment. We should look at Larian's success story and ask ourselves, how are we going to make our games better and create the next games that shake up the industry? Players should and must always expect more from us, never less. And now finally, the last major update we had on this topic came surprisingly from IGN, with a video from Destin Leggery, a director of video content strategy and a journalist himself. In this video, I won't play all of it for time's sake, though you can find links to this video and everything else I've mentioned in the description below. Destin, for the most part, more mirrors Juno's opinion and gives a pretty nuanced take of his own about this topic, which we'll talk about more in depth in our deep dive. The response to this, in my opinion, very good video, had a lot of pushback, with many developers who had spoken up to support Nelson speaking up yet again in an aggravated response to Destin. However, for the most part, this is where the drama has left off. However, almost no one has mentioned or covered the real nuance of what all this really means and how it reflects on the video game industry. So let's start our deep dive. The post that started it all, the basic opinion, Baldur's Gate 3, and I guess by inclusion any major AAA title with the same level of scope, is an anomaly by which other video games should not be judged. Now, why would Nelson hold this opinion? Well, he's an indie developer. He's worked for multiple indie games without huge budgets and publishers, and years worth of work from major game studios with locations all around the world. It shouldn't surprise anyone that if you append his original statement by saying no indie games should be held to their standard, that he's absolutely correct. Indie games can absolutely push boundaries and break the mold and push the industry and the culture forward for sure. I mean, look at games like Minecraft, Five Nights at Freddy's, Stardew Valley, and many others that respectively became the exact standards by which other games in their genre were judged. However, indie games more usually push the mold in less extravagant ways, mechanics different than what players are used to, art styles that are wildly different and innovative, Cuphead, great example of that, Braid, and so on and so forth. But as a whole, no. Nelson is right. They don't hold the funds, the staff, and the time generally to do something like Baldur's Gate 3. I love Dwarf Fortress. I've been playing it almost my entire life now, ever since the 90s. But I'm certainly not expecting Tarn and Zach Adams to port the game into Unreal Engine 5 and then have it finished in the next 5 years. However, this doesn't mean Nelson is completely right either. The fact is, AAA studios absolutely should be held to the same standard as Larian and Baldur's Gate 3. Or maybe it would be better to say some AAA studios should be. The fact is, there's two different kinds of game developers out there when it comes to AAA games. There's studios like Bethesda, CD Projekt Red, and Larian that might have 6, 8, 10 years or more to develop a game and make sure it comes out right. We're looking at you, Elder Scrolls 6. And these are the studios that should be held to that standard. On the other hand, we have developers and publishers like EA, who push out a new game in whatever franchise each year. And these are the studios that should not be held to that standard. But why is there this huge difference in standards and gaps between different kinds of studios and what standards they need to be held to? That's actually something very explainable. And this is where we come to the whole aspect as to how this discussion about Baldur's Gate 3 relates to the game industry as a whole. You see, new IPs, intellectual properties, can be very hit or miss. It's long been a standard in all the entertainment industries, from books to movies and definitely to games, that it's a lot safer to pump out a new title under a franchise that is already historically successful than to try launching a new one. For every Halo Combat Evolved or John Wick, there's 10 failed one-offs that didn't earn enough money or accolades to result in future titles. Indeed, launching a new IP is very similar to launching a new business. Most of them fail. And with the ever-increasing presence of business-minded decisions within the ranks of publishers and development studios, the executives in charge are of course going to look at this and say, why bother trying to make a new IP? Just release a new version of the old one, and hence we get the next yearly release of Madden or Call of Duty. Now, we can't knock the success of this. EA is an enormously huge publisher precisely because the same audience will rebuy the same titles year after year. And while that's shit from a creative and entertainment standpoint, sure, that is good business. And the market surrounding all of this still plows the field for the success of other creators with other projects within the same genre. Critically, I'm not a fan of games released under a mostly business-minded development cycle. They just can't be held up to the same standard. As I said before, not much different from indie developers. They don't have the time, staff, or money to make anything like Baldur's Gate 3. Nevertheless, managed to release one every single year. Larian had 6 years to release Baldur's Gate 3. Development started in 2017. But here's the difference, and the reason why they can't be held to that same standard, and a comparison I don't think I've heard anyone else make. Publishers and studios like EA aren't really in the same market as Larian. Larian and Bethesda, CD Projekt Red, and others like them are like movie studios. They're producing long-form, top-quality content, curated masterfully in a way that is indeed, hopefully, supposed to set a standard for long-form content. They're taking the time to get everything right and spending the money to do so. Other companies like EA are like TV producers and studios. They're pumping out sitcoms and episodic shows that are shorter form, use a similar theme or formula across every release in the franchise, and are most stringently held to an exacting and demanding release schedule. We make a sharp distinction in Hollywood in the market and industry difference between movies and TV shows. We don't compare the two directly, typically, because we all know how different those mediums are. And we really should be recognizing the same difference in the games industry too. I mean, look, no one's saying EA doesn't have the capacity to do what Larian did. Of course they do. They have the money and the staff. They could sit back and say, wait 5 years for the next Madden and make something so godforsakenly ridiculous that no other American football game would ever be able to compete. But that's just not the kind of content they choose to produce. And while I know that decision is mostly for business-minded reasons, they technically do have the duty to their stakeholders to be making them. And it's not an invalid decision either, as long as it works for them. And they're hardly alone, with Activision Blizzard and many other big publishers falling into the same business scheme as time passes as a way to have more stable cash flow. Now, returning to Nelson, this is unfortunately where he and many of the other developers, many from AAA studios who spoke up in the support of him, are wrong. Every game in the RPG genre released from a major AAA studio that does long-form content, again, Bethesda, CD Projekt Red, and so on and so forth, they should be compared. This is the exact market that they're competing in, with very similar circumstances and opportunities. And it's no surprise we find major AAA developers that work for episodic release companies responding to and supporting Nelson's tweets. They know the studios and publishers they work for will indeed never be able to put out or compete on that level. And they also know the industry doesn't really make the distinction between what they do and what the long-form content studios do, and feel, maybe rightly so, that it's unfair to compare them. And before I forget to mention it, by the way, Baldur's Gate 3 is not an anomaly. I remember the releases of Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, and Neverwinter Nights. Hell, not so long ago, I remember the release of Pillars of Eternity. And we're just talking niche D&D and D&D adjacent RPGs, but the fact is, every few years, something releases in most genres that really sets the standard and level for the market. And it's mostly always going to come from movie comparison developers like Larian. That's not new, and that's not a surprise. To get back to the drama, that's really where Juno and Destin got this right, especially here where Juno says, I am not saying all games should all be judged the same way across different production budgets and experiences, but I believe most players understand the context to not compare apples to oranges. And Destin takes us even further in his video, giving comparisons to many other RPGs that have recently had major problems because of developers from both episodic and sadly long-form studios that have made business-minded decisions that have really hurt their fans and players, including but not limited to the issue of microtransactions and battle passes. And he asks the question, why aren't developers trying to live up to Larian and Baldur's Gate 3? And again, while I don't think that's fair to apply to the episodic creators whose budgets and expectations and time constraints are entirely different, it is fair to apply to the long-term ones. And what's more, these criticisms aren't new. From Xbox's Major Nelson selling out to Mountain Dew and Doritos under the guidance of Microsoft, to the most predatory form of loot boxes and gotchas, developers and publishers have a long history of trying to push business-minded decisions into their products to the detriment of the industry and the fans. And there's always been pushback against it from fans, journalists, and even other developers and studios, not the least of which is studios like Larian and its founder and CEO, Sven Finke. And finally, what does this mean for the future of gaming? Well, first, if we really want to understand what's going on in the industry, we need to start making the distinction between the movie comparison studios and the episodic comparison studios and publishers. Regardless of the capabilities of them to do one or the other, there is a marked difference in how they operate, depending on the type of content they produce, and it's only right to recognize that. However, it's important to note that we currently don't, and with the advances in newer gaming engines like Unreal Engine 5, as well as AI support within games running NPCs and even helping programmers to code, we live in an era where the technology and infrastructure of AAA games, even 10 years from now, might look wildly and function wildly differently than they do currently. And while I can talk for hours about the games industry today, it's very hard to say what it might look like in 2033. But suffice to say, there will still likely be that unnoticed and silent distinction between these two different types of developers and publishers within gaming unless we address it. It's here to stay. We can only hope that other long-form productions follow Larian's example, as they usually have. and that one of our favorite forms of entertainment continues to advance and get better year after year, despite the protestations of people developing or producing indie games or short form content, which I would argue since the start of the industry, they have been. I hope you've enjoyed this video and maybe learned a little from it. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and have a good day.